I want to talk today about my top 10 games set in Japan. I've always found Japan to be a fascinating place, and as such, I think it's a really cool backdrop for video games. And what I'm going to present to you today is my personal top 10 list. So I'm not saying that these are unequivocally the best 10 games that take Japan as a setting, nor am I saying that this is the absolute exclusive ranking. You may disagree with the ranking. I may have a glaring omission. I've restricted this to games that I have played and games that were released here in North America. I've also omitted visual novels because obviously visual novels, being a distinctly Japanese genre, are set in Japan, and I've played a few that have come out over here that have taken the setting and used it in very interesting ways. Nonetheless, I'm going to leave that out. And again, I'm not looking at games that were released in Japan that have a significant language barrier. These are games that you can go out and pick up today. And again, even if you don't agree with how I've positioned them on this list, I think you can have a good time with them. So let's get into it. We'll start off with Akiba's Trip. This game was released on the PlayStation 3, relatively late in the PlayStation 3's lifespan, and I found this game visually interesting. I like the concept of it, this idea of being some sort of paranormal investigator based solely in Akihabara and kind of going around. It was obviously very juvenile with the whole stripping people. It's been a long time since I've played it. I don't really remember the story, but I put it on the list because I felt like the setting, the use of Akihabara had some potential. The gameplay was repetitive. Again, it was very juvenile. And then this was, I believe, the first one released, and on the PlayStation 3, it just had these horrible load times. So you'd kind of go through these really nice, visually appealing parts of the city, and then you'd go into an office, or you'd go into your headquarters, or you just go into a different section of the city, and the loading times were quite bad. And I remember just encountering so many of them that I ultimately put the game down. So I can't say anything substantial about how it progressed, or maybe you got some skills that opened up the gameplay a little bit, but it was interesting, at least conceptually, and it's one of those games where I believe they released it on Steam, and I might pick it up during a Steam sale, just hopefully put it on an SSD, and the loading times will be reduced. Number 9, Tokyo Mirage Sessions, a fusion between the Persona series and the Fire Emblem series set in modern-day Tokyo, with obviously a whole bunch of sort of supernatural elements. Visually, a really gorgeous game, I thought. I've only played the Wii U version, and I felt it was, a decent, traditional kind of RPG battle system with a couple different elements thrown in to keep things interesting. It's certainly a lot better, a lot smoother than Akiba's Trip, and I didn't play it for all that long, maybe the first 10 hours or so, 8 to 10 hours, and just kind of moved on to other things. I think the kind of criticism, what keeps it lower on the list, despite the fact that I think it effectively blends both type of games. If you're a fan of either of these series, I do think it's enjoyable, but it didn't stand out, at least in what I played, as using Japan as a setting. It looked good. It had the different kind of wacky or elements of Japanese culture. It threw in some very culturally specific humor, but compared to the other games on the list, I don't think it effectively used the setting, nor did it need to necessarily. It wasn't aiming at doing that, but I think as far as recent releases go, it does deserve a place on the list because it's a quality game for other reasons. Next up at number 8, we have an odd one, and that is Hammer and Hero for the PSP. And this is a side-scrolling action beat-em-up game Very, very difficult, and it just takes modern-day Japan, again, as a backdrop for creating interesting 2D side-scrolling levels. Has crazy boss characters. Seems like you're just kind of going through different, I'm going to assume this is Tokyo, just various levels that kind of play off of certain mental images we may have of Japan, and again, it has some of that zany humor you would come to expect, but I think it shows that even in a 2D setting, this game really does capture something pleasantly Japanese, and not every game has to be a role-playing game to have Japan as an effective setting. So I'll put Hammer and Hero on the list for that reason. Again, it's very, very difficult. It might be somewhat more expensive these days. It might be in the $70, $80 range. I wouldn't necessarily go out and spend the money on it at that level unless you want, a really challenging type of side-scrolling game, but belongs on the list nonetheless. So at number 7, The World Ends With You. I played this on the DS. I know it was released on smartphones and a couple of years ago for the Switch. I'm just going to talk about the version that I've played. This is, again, kind of a supernatural hunting game, or at least in kind of, you have the supernatural scenario where you have so many days to solve something. I can't remember the exact story, but you have so many days to, defeat these supernatural enemies. Otherwise, you will be erased from the world. It was, at the time, very, very innovative, and I went back to play it recently, kind of restart it, and I think you can see the really refreshing creativity behind this game. It's got a great soundtrack, though it may kind of come off as like a flash game. It does really capture a sense of place, in Shinjuku, in Tokyo, and it is engaging. I find that hasn't aged well. I think the forced DS mechanics with touchscreen attacks and things like that, it doesn't feel precise by today's touchscreen standards, and I think it kind of grates on you, which is why it's a little bit lower on this list for me. Now, a lot of people might argue that this is really a great and unique game, and it should be towards the top. And I think when you see the rest of my list, I think there's an argument to be made, if you really like this game, that there is a game at the top of the list that you could replace with The World Ends With You. But I love the setting, I love the style of it, and I believe, as of the date of this recording, today, they're releasing a new one. So I'll be looking forward to playing that and seeing how they modernize the formula. At number 6, I'm going to go with The Friends of Ringo Ishikawa. Now, this is a unique game for this list because it is not produced by a Japanese person or a Japanese company. This is an indie game on Steam, and I'm not sure where the guy's from who did this, but I believe he is a European. And this is a very, very interesting game, and actually the motivation for this video. This is ostensibly a take on the Kunio-kun series, River City Ransom, those types of games. It's in the first 2-3 hours, which I've played, it's a kind of run-of-the-mill side-scrolling beat-em-up game, but it places those mechanics within a very interesting, very exploratory RPG. It creates this town in Japan, and you are a kind of high school thug who's torn between getting his life together and trying to graduate high school, and then being a kind of dropout and, criminal, beating people up, and sort of rising through the underworld. I don't know how that plays out. I haven't finished the game. Time for me these days has been very limited for gaming, but like I said, the hour or two, or the 2 or 3 hours that I spent with this, it was really refreshing because it doesn't kind of give you any direction. It just sort of places you in this town, and you go around. There's a sense of kind of melancholy, this malaise, this idea that you don't really have to do anything. It has these mechanics where you could just kind of like sit in the park and smoke and reflect. It's got a good soundtrack. It doesn't have the polish, obviously, of a game produced by a company, but it is interesting, it is refreshing, and it creates a sense of place in a 2D environment better than a lot of games I've played, so I think it's worth checking out. So at 5, I'm going to go with Shin Megami Tensei Soul Hackers. I had played this as a Saturn import, or at least tried to play it, and I just couldn't. It was very, very Japanese heavy, but maybe the 5 to 10% of the game that I got through with the help of GameFAQs and things like that was interesting. And again, you talk about the sense of place. What this game did aesthetically for me was create this cyberpunk-ish late 90s, early 2000s birth of the internet dystopian vibe that you would see in something like Serial Experiments Lane. It just sort of captured that early internet era really well. I found, like, I could see myself. Now, I didn't play this in the late 90s, right when it came out, but I could kind of see myself, in high school, really being drawn to the art style, to the music, and to the atmosphere created by this game. When I played it on the 3DS a couple of years ago when it came out here, it did the same thing for me. Now, it's been cleaned up a little bit, and I wish I could play the original Saturn one in English, but it still captures that atmosphere and does it in that period-specific Japan. So it's a really good Shin Megami Tensei game, I find. I haven't finished it, but it's one of those games that I would really like to go back to if I ever got some time. At number 4, I have Ganbari Gomon 2 for the Super Famicom. Talked about this in the past on the channel, did a full review of it. But this is a weird one because, yeah, this is not modern-day Japan. This is a kind of mythical, alternate history recreation of a Japanese, I don't know what you want to call Ganbari Gomon. I believe he was a real person, but a kind of, mythical figure, retelling that with aliens and zaniness. But it really is I think one of the better platformers of the time, and it combines RPG elements with solid platforming, some good Mode 7 stuff. It's a unique game, and I'm making an exception here. As I said, I wasn't going to go with games that were released in Japan. This was, I believe, a Japanese exclusive. I'm not sure if it's gotten a virtual console or Switch release. There have been other games in the series here, the Mystical Ninja series. Those are more overhead games, but this is a good side-scroller. It doesn't require really any Japanese. It's a classic Super Nintendo 2D game, and it feels very playfully specific to Japan. I like the version of Japan that they're presenting here. I think one of my favorite levels is the kind of sumo palace where you're kind of moving in the rafters and then fighting an alien sumo robot. It is fun, and it's easy to find, at least in ROM form. Definitely check it out. So number 3 is Shenmue 1, which I played when it came out. I believe it was 1999. It was one of the early Dreamcast releases. And I did do a video on this, and I talked about how you have to appreciate this game. To me, this was really my first open world game, and it was my first kind of experience playing a virtual version of Japan. So I think it has strong nostalgia. And I do think it's not only for those who might have been interested in Japanese culture, but also for people who are excited about the turn of the century. What was that going to mean for games going forward? And this idea that you could have a life simulator, you could have day-night cycles, you could interact with everyone in this little town. It was, in a lot of ways, a tech demo for the future of third-person games, and it did it in this really unique cultural setting. Now, it had terrible voice acting. It's extremely slow. It feels very archaic, and I will admit, I played the re-release on the PlayStation 4. It's hard to go back to this game. It's not fun. So if you wanted to, and this is where I said earlier, if you wanted to slot The World Ends With You into place 3 in place of Shenmue, or even Ganbari Gomon, I think that's, really a fine choice. But for me, Shenmue was the game that introduced me to Japan as a video game setting, and I do think it is a historically significant game, so I'll give it position 3. At number 2, I'm going to list the Persona series, specifically Persona 3 or Persona 5. I think those games captured the Japanese setting the best. Obviously, Persona 4 is a wonderful game in its own regard, more of a small town setting, but when I played Persona 3, it was actually after I got my PlayStation 3, so I was like, I don't want to go back to PS2, but this game is getting good reviews. Let me pick it up. I think it came out in 2008. So I got it, and I didn't know what I was going to expect here, other than that it was a good JRPG. And when you talk about these games as life simulators or slice of life games, and if you think about that genre in anime and manga, just kind of presenting a relaxed vision of life in Japan. I think Persona 3 did that, at least for me. Again, not having played the other games in the series at that point, the high school setting, the building of social links as a way to level up your characters for the underworld battles. It was unique. It was interesting. It wasn't doing anything new fundamentally for turn-based JRPG games, but it was really reconfiguring a lot of the elements of those games in a new way in the context of a dating or life simulator. So I found that to be fascinating. I found it to be a very relaxing game to play, at least those segments of it. But obviously Persona 5 is just a fabulous game. I've talked about it before on the channel. I think it's one of my favorite games of the previous PS4 generation. And it does everything Persona 3 does, but does it better. So, that would be, if you've never played a Persona game, I think you could kind of jump in with 5. For me, I just enjoyed number 3, so I'll set them as equal and put them both in position 2. So, first place goes to the Yakuza series, and I've done so many videos on Yakuza. It's my favorite kind of modern video game series, and I'm going to say Persona, or just like I said with Persona, Yakuza 4 or 0 would be my choices as kind of a jumping in point, but really they're all good. Any one of them you could get on the PlayStation 4 are good games. I think this really captures all of the elements of the previous games on this list that I liked. It has RPG elements. It is, to a certain degree, a life simulator. It has zany cultural references. It has a very kind of culturally specific main story. that nonetheless kind of can be followed if you like the kind of gangster movies and things like that. And it is, I think, a celebration of video games, not only because it's, I've always said it's a 3D Streets of Rage. It presents life as a game, all these little tasks and mini games that you have to do. You can actually play old school video games in the Yakuza series. It is just a depiction of the land that gave us video games, by and large. Obviously it existed before the Japanese got involved with the Famicom, things like that. But anyway, you grew up in the 80s and 90s. Japan was the land that produced video games, and in the Yakuza series, you're playing a game set in that country that portrays life and your quest as a series of games. So I always found that to be the allure of the Yakuza series. It's still going strong. It has so many different iterations. In a way, I think it does what Shenmue sought out to do, but it does it in a more entertaining way. And it is a very, I'm not going to say faithful representation of Japan because I haven't gone there, but the detail that they try to tease out in the various cityscapes is incredibly impressive. So it stands at the top of this list, I think, with good justification. So there you go. There is my list. And before I sign off, I want to just say a couple more things about why I think Japan is a unique setting, or why these games are unique in taking Japan as a setting. I mean, obviously I said with Yakuza, Japan was the kind of birthplace of the gaming that I got into in the 80s and 90s. It was on the avant-garde of technology and digital culture, and so I think Japan as a setting is cool in that regard, particularly to play 80s Japan and something like Yakuza 0. But I think beyond that, these games present, some stronger than others, but nonetheless a kind of virtual travel, a virtual tourism, which I think is interesting. Yakuza most strongly. Shenmue obviously started that. Akiba's Trip, to a degree, has that. Just this idea of exploring a place in 3D space that is constructed to have some connection to reality. And again, I can't evaluate how faithful some of these portrayals are, so I can just say, as someone who's interested in Japan and never been there, it is nice to do a little virtual tourism. And I'm very surprised that other games haven't done this. I mean, a few do come to mind. Obviously, you have the historical virtual tourism of something like the Assassin's Creed series, which does a great job of establishing a sense of place, although I think the weakness of that series is kind of the repetitive gameplay loops and the fact that your time in these historical settings is interspersed with, I thought, the unnecessary and goofy waking up in the modern-day corporate headquarters and that whole kind of story angle to those games. Oddly enough, I think a game that tries to do this is European Truck Simulator 2, which for someone who spent a fair degree of time on the highways of Europe, there is something very accurate about that. I've never driven a truck, but nonetheless, traveling through the night, going across borders, different cities, listening to the actual radio stations they could be listening to in these countries. It has a kind of meditative quality to it. It's not really a game in the sense that these are games, but it does have, I think, a kind of virtual tourism element to it. The Horizon series does that to a degree, but none do it in the way that these games do it. And I would love a third-person game, maybe set in Russia, set in France. I think the backdrop becomes a way to tell an interesting and culturally specific story. And I wish game developers would take advantage of different cityscapes and different backdrops to tell these different stories. So again, that's my top 10 list. Let me know if I forgot anything, how you would rank these games, and what are your top 10 games set in Japan.